I've lost a member of my panel. They're just going over. Okay. Now, this is a session about post-colonial spatialities. And that sounds formidable and difficult. I think space is kind of changing. I mean, there was a time when you got two sorts of people who talked about space. One, if I'm rude to one of the Michaels, as it were, was geographers who said, we've got to reinvent our subject, let's put space in every second sentence. I think geography's come a long way since then. The other were Heideggerians who said, space and being, you thought, oh Christ, I'm going to the toilet. Now, since then, space has become serious. We're not over endowed with time, so I'm not going to rabbit on too much. I'm going to introduce the speakers. But there has to be a little warm-up, and the warm-up would go something like this. We're talking about London, right? Now, at the moment, there's a very interesting thing about London. This is the only serious city you can think of that for 14 years has not had a city government, right? Which is, if you quietly think about it, absolutely appalling, right? The second point you should notice, and this was alluded to earlier, is we're about to get one. But the government is terrified about us having a real one, right? It would like to have some happy stooge who, smiled and looked at their pager as mayor and did nothing for N years, and then, kind of shut the whole show down, took over from Robin Cook as foreign minister, and that was that, right? Meanwhile, the 32 rotten boroughs carry on with their tricks. This does nothing for London. London is in a horrible mess at a governmental level. The only thing that's saving it is what we heard before. It's a city of people, it's a city of events, it's ultimately a city of villages, right? The villages are alive, the big picture is a mess. That's my humble opinion. What I'm looking for is a London Umberto Bossi. Scotland is going to change the political picture in this country because very soon the Labour Party is going to have in Scotland a party that can shoot it. Scottish nationalists. That does away with a serious chunk of the MPs that will get in normal politics, not like 1997. If we had a London party that could threaten to take away the MPs it's got in London, Labour would always be an English opposition party and it would run scared, right? I'm too old, I'm too bored, I spend far too much time abroad. If there's somebody out there who wants to be London's Umberto Bossi, do it. But you know who Umberto Bossi is, I hope. Now, let me introduce to you the speakers. Firstly, we have our chairperson, Lesley Lokho, who teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I carefully got that through, because, complicated things are difficult for me, and who was educated at the Bartlett, so in a sense is somebody who was educated here and teaches in another big city with interesting problems. Then our first speaker is Michael Hibbert, who's Professor of Town Planning at Manchester University and who splits his time, interestingly, I hope, between London and Manchester, and revealed to me, fascinatingly, that he's on a fellowship for 2 years from something called the Royal Commission for the 1851 Exhibition. In other words, he brilliantly found one of these sources of funding that nobody else had heard of. However, I'm letting you in on the trick now. Go look it up in the Charities Handbook and get the next one. Okay. Now, so, Michael Keith, and by the way, I should say, all the three speakers begin with M, right? This was a deliberate choice, right? I promise you, the first names begin with M. In the London Consortium, of which I'm academic director, we spent a long time deciding what we'd read next term, and we decided we'd look with authors that began with B, right? Which has been quite useful and actually remarkably successful. It's as good a way as doing things as any other, I know. But let us turn to the other M, which is Michael Keith, who's sitting here, who's Director of Urban and Community Research at Goldsmiths College. Right? but who, it must be said, as it were, is somebody who has combined the worlds of the academy and, is one. I mean, I denounce the boroughs, and he'll excuse me because there are always diamonds on every dunghill, and he is one of them, right? He was formerly leader of Tower Hamlets Council, and he's been one of the instigators of the Rich Mix Centre in East London. And, when I'm rude about the boroughs, I mean to be rude about the boroughs. We have some of the worst politicians and the rottenest administrators of any city you can think of, right? And we've got to improve our game, right? But the boroughs are not real communities, and this is one of the problems. But in parts of London, they coincide, and there are people who really make an effort. Just as we were seeing earlier, that Hackney is a real area. Parts, certainly of southeast London, are real areas, and they're fighting back. And having somebody who's both, a civic leader and an academic is a valuable contribution to this. So, you're most welcome. Now, Mohsen Mostafavi, I have to be very careful because this is, when I'm not playing at academic director of the London Consortium, my boss at one level. I have to say that, you're sitting here in an institution that really has gone through a revolution, and which is, I think, it is, but it's also, if I say on the way to, in the sense that it's done a lot, but it's going to do a lot more, being a path-breaking institution on cultural policy, urban policy, and architecture at the same time. It always was this. But at one point, I think we got into a position we thought that everybody was standing at the rail of the AA bar were the only people that mattered. And, that was kind of half true, but never quite true. And, all that talent round the bar has, begun to focus itself outwards, and it's begun to do so under Mohsen's leadership, and I think the institution is, in a sense, a really, really interesting place to work in, and that is entirely due to him. So this is our chairperson and our panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce them.
Great. Can everyone hear? Is this microphone switched on? Can you all hear? Great. I come to this conference in two ways. I feel at a slight disadvantage. Listening to the previous panel, when I heard that members of the panel had known each other for some 30 years, I have to say that this is the first time I've ever met any of my co-panelists. And secondly, I no longer live in London, which I now live in Chicago, which brings a certain perspective to the events of the past couple of days. I'd like to say something very short about my own background, which I hope will sort of set or suggest a point of departure for the conversation that we're about to have. And that was that I was born in Ghana in West Africa, in an already independent country. So the struggle for independence was actually my father's generation, not mine. And sort of following on from what Salman Rushdie said this morning, the history books in a sense had already been rewritten. I came to Britain at the age of 18 to a boarding school, to St James's in the Abbey for young ladies in West Malvern. And it was the first experience I had of being black. In a sense, I became black in Britain. I have a Jewish white mother, and one of the issues that I learned from my 2 years at boarding school, which was later to become very sort of important in my own development, was that being black was actually about being not white, not about being black, but in a sense it was about not meeting the standard. And the question of standard, the question of the norm or the center, is something that interests me in my own work very much. And it's something that I think has particular relevance to any conversation about spatiality, architecture, or the urban fabric. So in a sense, in Britain, I became aware that coloniality, post-coloniality, blackness, difference, etc., were both subjective experiences, i.e. in the sense of one living through the condition of being black, but also objective experiences in the sense of understanding that they're historically, geographically, culturally constructed. One of the issues that I'd like to sort of begin today's conversation with is that if architecture and the urban fabric, or our ways of understanding it, urbanism, whatever you want to call it, is very much influenced by our understanding of what is the standard, what is the norm, what are the ways in which the post-colonial subjects have affected or influenced the architectural space that we occupy? And I'd like to start by asking that question of Michael Hibbert. How has the post-coloniality of London affected it spatially?
Good. Thank you, Lesley. In answering that question, I, like Lesley, am affected by the fact that I have left London. I see it from a distance. Not from Chicago, but from Manchester. Still seems a long way away. Because London, seen even from the end of a 2.5-hour Richard Branson train journey, is a highly distinctive city, and a city whose qualities I haven't heard enough about today. London is a multi-ethnic city which works. Let's above all take that as our starting point. London is the city of the rich mix. The rich culinary mix we did hear about, the rich sexual mix, which we haven't heard about. To read from my attempt to analyse this in the book I wrote on London, high proportions of British-born black and Asian Londoners have white partners. Many as high as 1 in 2 Caribbean men, 1 in 3 Caribbean women, 1 in 5 male Indians or African Asians. That's statistical data from the 1990 census, and the upcoming census in the year 2000 is going to show that process of mixing miscegenation proceeding apace. And that's a success story. That's the story which again emerges very clearly from the statistical report on multi-ethnic London produced yesterday by the London Research Centre, which shows the astonishing diaspora of all the ethnic minorities who are now in many parts of London, of course, engross the ethnic majority and overall are 40% within the physical space of London. Diffused throughout the space, with the exception of the one area where this doesn't quite apply, which is still predominantly white, is the area from 3 o'clock on the dial down to 6 o'clock. Hornchurch down to Croydon, and it's only the extreme edge of the dial where that applies. Of course, that is Stephen Lawrence country. But I mean, let's put that on one side. Let's remember the bigger truth, friends, which is this is a multicultural world city which works. It's an unpolarised city. It's got an urban economy which works, which favours upward mobility. And if you come from segregated Chicago, if you compare it with segregated Paris, if you look at monocultural Tokyo, the contrast is as extraordinary as Stuart Hall remembers the contrast back to his moment of arrival in the London of 1951. And I want to ask a very simple question, but I think is in a way the question we were summoned here today to look at, which is what is the contribution of space, of spatial design, of spatial management, of spatial policy to this? Simple question, and I've got a bog standard simple answer to it. The answer is in the streets. The streets of London are the answer. And really, just for the next 10 minutes, I want to try and explain my, of course, simplification and put some meat on those bones. 2 years ago, he wasn't our chairman, he was our lead man from Birkbeck, the college which he comes from, Birkbeck College. 2 years ago, the Spatial Systems Laboratory, or some such thing, produced a Christmas card from Birkbeck College based on the crunching of a lot of data about shopping centres. And it had 2 colours on this card. It was a map of London with some larger blue splodges, which you could recognise as being the standard shopping sub-centres of London. Romford, Ilford, Wood Green, Kensington High Street and so on. And those are the officially designated shopping centres, for which there are things called code plans. So they're recognised in the planning system as being shopping centres. And then, like as though somebody had fired a shotgun at this Christmas card, it was totally peppered with red. Red, particularly in the form of lines stretching out from the centre. And this was a digitised image of the Yellow Pages postcodes of every commercial premise in London. It was a simple attempt to demonstrate, by 2-colour contrast, the reality of London shopping, which is a continuous ribbon development of little shops and premises and workshops and cafes and pubs and sex shops and video arcades and so on, which starts at Trafalgar Square and which in many cases, such as Green Lanes, extends all the way out to the Green Belt. And the simplified notion of shopping as something that goes on in an inverted commas shopping centre. Tower Hamlets, where your two Michaels come from, doesn't have shopping centres, at least it never did. Tower Hamlets shopping consisted entirely of Roman Road and Whitechapel Road and Petticoat Lane, and a number of other linear strips, which fell out of the bottom of all the standard models of what shopping is. What produced this extraordinary pattern of joined up red dots? Route master country. Hop on the bus, hop off the bus, in any direction. What produced it? Well, the simplified story would actually start with the hub of a colonial empire, which back in the 17th century was already producing a very distinctive pattern of low-density suburbanisation. No land warfare, no wars. London was the dispersed city. And when you look at 18th century maps of London, what strikes you most are the big grounds of villas, where nabobs, East Indian, people who'd made money from trade, the carriage folk of this prosperous bourgeois whose wealth was drawn from the empire, went out to live in the London countryside. It was a very, very clear pattern, very, very early on. And what it produced was, and again, look at an 18th century map to see it, a tentacular ribbon development growth of tea houses and stables and pubs on all the carriage roads going out of London, right the way down to Croydon, right the way up the Lee Valley, right the way out to Woodford, right the way along to Uxbridge. The Bath Road was almost solidly built up 200 years ago. Now this is a very interesting pattern. It was the pattern famously explored by Rasmussen in his book, The Unique City. London was the first city to suburbanise. And then you roll the film forward to the infill of these octopus-like arms which stretched out in all directions. They infilled first with terraced housing, then with semi-detached, and London grew further and faster at a lower density than any other city in the world, right the way up to the late 1930s. And then for all sorts of political reasons, as the empire ended, London stopped growing. A historic decision which bounded the further reaches of those tentacles and the infilled mass which had been created. And in the basement of Senate House, I do urge you to go. It's a sort of thing, the most wonderful sight. If you go into Senate House, go down the stairs to the coffee machine area, there's a wall map the size of this wall, a totally enormous wall map, which is London as a single unitary object. And it's an A to Z map. So every little street and alley name is there, totally, of course, indecipherable, but on the map. And the sort of bringing together of the very small and the very large is a strangely unsettling and wonderful thing. But the point I want to make is that London stopped growing. And so all its post-war energy has been refracted back into the consolidated mass of the built-up area. And the other thing that happened, that was a big planning decision, the other thing that failed to happen was what was to have gone with it, the reconstruction of London's radial roads as motorways running through sleeves of green landscape. That was the planner's other vision for London. And that didn't happen. The green belt did happen. London stopped growing, but for all sorts of political reasons, which I explore in this book, the reconstruction of the fabric of London, the first thing which planners said had to go to the Whitechapel Road. Well, let me read the names. This is the real answer to today's seminar lies in this wonderful litany of going clockwise: Kingsland Road, Roman Road, Whitechapel Road, Old Kent Road, Walworth Road, Clapham Road, Wandsworth Road, King's Road, Chiswick High Road, Uxbridge Road, Harrow Road, we've got to 10 o'clock, Edgware Road, Camden High Street, Kentish Town Road, Holloway Road, Green Lanes above all. Never is there a better illustration of a continuous strip of commercial frontage entirely colonised by the new Londoners. Now, here we've got essentially an 18th century ribbon development infilled and redeveloped in the 19th century, neglected for the first half of the 20th century, and then preserved in aspect by the failure of planning. So, the first part of my answer is the physical fabric of London is a surprisingly unchanged fabric. No other city in Britain has retained this conservatism of its streets. Hardly any other city in Europe has kept intact its street texture to the degree that London has. That's one half of the answer. The other half of the answer is London, in terms of its people, in terms of us, is like a blown egg. The transformation of London's population has been so radical. And the question I leave you with, what is the relationship between those two processes? The intact public realm of little, cheap, accessible shops, of restaurant space, I hate this word, flaneur, but I mean, if you're going to talk about it, translate it into English and say, as I just did, route master bus space, which exists in linear form and enables you to travel through London in any direction, and enables people and businesses and incoming minorities to work their way up through the system as the Greek Cypriots did. They came in 1935, the first wave of Greek Cypriots. They were waiters in the French restaurants in Soho. They opened fabric, garment workshops in Tottenham Court Road. By the mid-1950s, they were out in Camden Town, and they moved their way up and out. And still, there are Greek Cypriots who travel back from suburban opulence on the outskirts by the edge of the Greenbelt to patronise barbers down by Newington Green. And of course, Turkish Cypriots had a slightly different trajectory. They went up the Kingsland Road, or they went down to Bromley. Well, I can't begin to explore the sort of possible ramifications, the synthesis between people and space. But all I can do is just leave you with that question: what, in your lived experience as Londoners, might be these sorts of relationships? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. I guess in a sense, the short presentation has confirmed what has actually been one of my deepest beliefs, that architecture is phenomenally slow to respond to these kinds of questions. And as Michael suggested, he's left us with another question, which I now put to Michael Keith. What have the post-colonial inhabitants of London done to the city?
Thank you. When Salman Rushdie was reading this morning, I was reminded of a passage which I think either follows or just precedes one of the pieces that he rendered so beautifully earlier on today, where the two main protagonists of Satanic Verses, Saladin Chamcher and Jibril Farishta, are when they're landed in London, and Jibril is going through the madness that Rushdie was talking through this morning, and he tries to map London, to make London visible, to make it legible through a cartography, and fails. And the failure of the cartographic exercise that is present in Satanic Verses, I think, is one of the organising themes that at its heart makes me want to just touch on three very quick reservations about the notion of making London legible through a metaphor of post-coloniality before trying to talk through a couple of more specific instances. I just want to say a word about incommensurability, a word about urbanism, and a word about government. Because I think we need to be, and I'm sorry to change the register somewhat, but I do think we need to be innately suspicious of a variety of narrative forms that make the city comprehensible through a succession of places and spaces. I think Benjamin did not have quite such a powerful metaphor as his rejection of Whiggish history in the notion of the Angelus Novus blasted through time. There was also in his work a rejection in his city writing of the ordering of things, a kind of rejection of some of the misappropriations in a kind of Deserto-esque romance of the street, a problematization of different views precisely because of the incommensurability of those views. And so I think when we are looking at a time where we might celebrate cosmopolitanism, it is always important, it's essential, I think, as Paul did last night, to place alongside a gazetteer of exotica a cartography of horror, because although Time Out may celebrate Brick Lane as the next Hoxton, Brick Lane as the next Portobello, and Deptford as the next Hoxton, as the fridge is turned into this site in Brixton where there is a particular kind of culture that is commodified, valorized under the sign of blackness. There is a sense in which, alongside those lists, must be the Weaver's Field where Mukhtar Ahmed was nearly beaten to death quite recently, the events in Brixton and the deaths in Brixton jail, the even greater number of deaths in Stoke Newington that featured on the film earlier on. And so I think it is important to bear in mind both registers within a suspicion of narratives that rely on forms of space and spatiality to render comprehensible the city. The second point, which follows on from that, which is, I think, in the traditions of urbanism and in the writing around urbanism, there is also a sense in which it is important to remember that bound up in so many of those celebrations of the places where strangers can go out and meet in public, there are hidden others, that you can go back to the exclusions of Periclean Athens, that you go back to the relationship between civilization and genocide, you go back to the relationship between citizenship and slavery, and that in all of those narratives that celebrate urbanism that are very often re-invoked, I think, in the sorts of architectural discourse that you see Richard Rogers parading in his notion of city life. There are hidden stories, always hidden stories. There's a kind of constitutive outside, if you like, that is present in those stories and that needs to be pulled in, because it is pulled in through a language of race, through a presence of something that is not quite there. And the third reservation I want to just touch on is that there is, at the same time, an importance, I think, to think through the ways in which, if Michel Foucault has taught us to scrutinize the ways in which the subjects and objects of government are fabricated, and if Foucault teaches us to kind of reject both the white communitarianism that is at the heart of the third way, and also some of the naivety of some of the celebrations of politics of civil society beyond the state, and the kind of stuff that John Keane and even Václav Havel were talking about a few years ago, we need to remember that there remains what might be a transactional boundary, but still a boundary between state and civil society, where we can't think about the state unproblematically or as a simple object of theory, but the state remains territorialized through forms of governmentality that at times create subjects of government that create a reality to everyday life, wherein in places like in London, the local state is significant in planning, it is significant in how you live your life, it is significant in how you go to school, it is significant in how you die, it is significant in the campaigns that surround the good life and the just life that marred the horrific incidents around not only Stephen Lawrence but the numerous other deaths that we've seen in recent years. And so in that sense, I think that whilst accepting all sorts of critique about forms of municipal multiculturalism, I also would want to, as Paul did yesterday, point back to a certain necessary institutional form that means that the boundary between local government and civil society means that I don't think there is some purity of community, some purity of an outside of government, but there is always a complicity. And we need to think through the ways in which that boundary between civil society and the state is transactionally racialized. And I think in that context, I want to just talk through a couple of very specific examples. And the examples actually begin when we've passed through just a few very almost subliminal rather than sublime images of the public spaces of the city and the languages that we see in the public spaces. I want to take you through a couple of examples which actually try and suggest that we need to think through the manner in which cosmopolitanism is narrativized, is turned into a story in particular public spaces, not a kind of deterministic, sub-Skinnerian version of public space that sometimes emerges in the work of Richard Sennett, I believe, but it is instead actually thinks of the ways in which narrative forms are rendered visible. And I want to just use two examples. The one is actually St Mary's Gardens, quite often invoked in the writing, the very white writing of Ian Sinclair, who actually talks at times about looking through this old watering hole and suggesting in his ever slightly nostalgic hunt for the Whitechapel mound that if you look through the hole you actually see, or is made visible, one of the old ley lines of London. St Mary's Gardens is where Richard Brandon, the regicide, the person who executed Charles I, is buried. He was paid £30. It also was known locally for many years as Itchy Park. It was appropriated in the song, the Itchy Park. It is also, I think, more importantly, the place, certainly more importantly in contemporary context, it's the place where Altabali was murdered in 1978. And I think if you actually look at what happens there now, there is a continual debate, a struggle over naming, articulation, possession, spatiality, in which the contest and incommensurability of different versions, different notions of the place itself are worked through, are made visible as forms of narrative, sometimes as erasure. Altabali Park has been renamed Altabali Park from St Mary's Gardens for over 20 years, and yet still every year, 15, 20, 30 times a year, the name Altabali, as you see here, this is taken only 2 days ago, is erased, is reinscribed by the local authority. At the same time, the place is the site of the Shahid Minar, just put up in the last few weeks. The Shahid Minar itself creates a memorial that replicates a memorial in Oldham, and in part is a replica or a miniature of a memorial in Dhaka, which was actually put up to celebrate the language riots of the 50s in Dhaka, the struggle for recognition of the Bengali language, which in part plays into debates around the tension between secularism and universalism in Islam, plays out locally in a mixture of politics that is in part about forms of racism against the renaming of the park, the construction of the Shahid Minar 2 weeks ago on Martyrs' Day, the 21st of February, for the first time. Several hundred people memorialized that enormously significant event so many years ago when it was alleged that Bengali was being Arabized, and at a time when the West Pakistan government were enforcing a particular version of neo-colonial rule in East Pakistan through the language of language. But the Shahid Minar itself, in its kind of resolutely modernist design, also invokes all sorts of dispute locally. It actually comes out of a planning gain deal that was done with a bunch of Irish Catholic builders, the Ballymore family, who themselves were involved in constructing a development which threatened the East London Mosque and played into an enormous politics that created all sorts of tensions, both between the formations of the local state and the relationship between local government and what was or was not properly seen as what we euphemistically call planning gain. It's sometimes closer to kind of an institutionalized corruption of local government. But also, at the same time, plays into very complex debates on the relationship between the secular and the profane in contemporary British Bangladeshi society. Some of the mosques actually also objected to the erection of the Shahid Minar. And I think the ways in which these issues play through point to a debate about articulation of spaces, which, as I say, I think undermines the distinction in Henri Lefebvre's work between spaces of representation and representation of spaces, but makes us think again instead about the ways in which certain spaces become visible through a particular narrative form. And I just want to move on and close very quickly on another case in point, which is actually being taken forward at the moment. The Rich Mix Centre, which has been in development for 7 to 8 years from a group of people who initially were trying to put forward some sort of exhibition. It was initially started off as a museum without artifacts, a way of exhibiting, valorizing some of the things that were happening in East London. It's actually a project that has gone through a wide range of forms and a wide range of sites. It was initially hoped to site at the Orientalist place known as the Moorish Market in Fournier Street, a gorgeous building that is actually heritage listed and is a particular 1890s invocation of Orientalist architecture. However, it will now be taking place, at least temporarily, in the old Bishopsgate goods yard. Again, a site of transition, and work's being done by both the Centre for New Ethnicities Research and Panchayat to try and create in this space a space of dialogue, a space in which it is possible, potentially, to articulate certain kinds of cosmopolitanism. Sanam Prasad, the architect, is actually present in the audience today. And I think the only thing I want to conclude on is by saying that it's a space that is far from straightforwardly, I think, a celebration of cosmopolitanism. I would not want it to be a celebration of some kind of straightforward exotica that would fit into those kind of gazetteers that you almost might expect to find in the space in The Guardian on a Friday. But instead, hopefully, is something that does actually reflect some of the complications of post-coloniality that I tried to point to at the beginning. The complications around the ways in which it actually bridges this distance between the city and Brick Lane. The Rich Mix Centre, as based in Bishopsgate, will actually, or the Rich Mix Exhibition, as based in Bishopsgate, will actually run the length from the boundary of the city right up to Brick Lane. It has an exit onto Brick Lane, and there's a building that is being brought back into use. But also at the same time, it involves an implication of the local state, of local government, of funding regimes, of objects of government, that transactional boundary between the state and civil society that remains so deeply problematic. And finally also, I think the ways in which it memorializes or presents multiculture and cosmopolitanism is both far from resolved and far from unproblematic. But hopefully at least it is a beginning of something that I wouldn't reject too many of the things that have been said about local government earlier on today, but it might at least make some move towards a kind of presentation, a presentation of the complexity of cosmopolitanism that I think is sometimes absent from some of the more museum-based celebrations of contemporary multiculture. Thank you.
Now, Mohsen Mostafavi is also going to grapple with the issue of the post-colonial and urbanism, and it would be great if you could also talk a little bit about the school, about the AA and its role in these issues.
My presentation, because of the range of issues, is going to be a little bit rushed. I will try to be fairly quick so that we could have as much time for discussion as possible. I think, of course, in the context of a School of Architecture, we are involved in the making of projects. We do things that are forms of speculation. Our work doesn't stop, in a sense, at the level of interpretation, rereadings, and so on. We actually are engaged with this idea of trying to do things which, by definition, are based on the assumption that what we do are going to make things better. We just don't do things for the sake of doing them. And so I think, in a way, we are involved in this idea of making some kind of a synthetic or synthesis out of all the things that have been said, and there are a lot of things that have been said, a lot of things that one has to think about. And how can we, in a sense, then be engaged with a series of projects that will make some kind of difference? And I think there are obviously a lot of things that one can discuss, but I would like to, just in case we run out of time, and I as I said, I'll try to not go on, to say that I would like us, in a sense, to at least address three topics. One is that I feel, in some way, slightly differently from what Michael Hibbert said, or at least an extension of what Michael Hibbert said, in terms of all the sort of fantastic things that are happening in London. I feel that still we really need to address new conceptions of public space, in the sense that the kind of population explosion that happened in the 19th century and the kind of what you might call the weak fabric of the city has now been extended and expanded through a whole series of projects that I think Mark Cousin touched on, to do with the kind of 1960s, a certain vision of housing as a zoned operation, which we need to rethink in terms of how that space is transformed. That's sort of one topic. The other, I think that as architects, or when we're thinking about the city, we obviously need to think about new conceptions of hybrid structures, or hybridities, in a sense, which are themselves related to issues of architectural infrastructure or infrastructural projects. And lastly, very, very briefly, in the context of the recent discussions about the whole question of mayor of London and London having some kind of central administration, is the relationship between city citizenship and the concept of certain structures which might provide certain democratic opportunities for the citizens, in a way. But before we do that, maybe if I could have the first slide. Are we on the left or right? Yes. This, I think, is an image that many of you are probably familiar with. But I think we have talked a lot in the last 2 or 3 days about the whole question of immigration, about the question of migration of bodies in space. But one of the things that I think happens in architecture all the time, has happened historically, is the whole issue of migration of buildings. Migration of architecture and migration of urbanism, architectural ideas. Ideas don't operate in the same kind of with the same sort of physical boundaries that bodies in space are constantly confronted with borders and territories and so on. And I think there has been a history of migration of architectural and urban ideas that I think is maybe in terms of the whole concept of making projects, might be a useful thing for us to be reminded of that. And I think this is a very interesting painting. The top painting is a painting by Canaletto. It's done in the middle of the 18th century. It's a painting that was referred to quite a lot in terms of urban history 10 or 15 years ago. And what is quite important about it, it's part of a very small group of paintings done by Canaletto, which operate under the title of Capriccio or Fantasia, or fantasy paintings, which are really dealing with the idea of imagination. How do you imagine things? And what is key about this is that Canaletto takes 2 buildings, the one here on the left and the one here, the Basilica and the Palazzo Chiericati, from Vicenza, and a project of Palladio. These are all 2 buildings by Palladio and a project by Palladio for the Ponte di Rialto in Venice, and constructs this kind of fictive landscape, which is made of 2 real buildings and an imaginary project, and places it in the context of a situation which might be Venice. This is, in fact, the kind of another painting by Canaletto, which shows the real Ponte di Rialto of Venice. I think the thing that's really key about this is how the painting sets up this ambiguity between whether it is Venice or whether it's Vicenza. And the buildings have that kind of capacity of, in a sense, confusing the observer because of that condition. And I think in architecture we often are dealing with this issue of a project or a construction which also travels, is situated, and through its situation also reconstructs a particular locality. It's really the idea of constructing relational projects. And it's the relationality of those projects that then constitutes a particular form of urban condition. Now, many, many times now, when we're working as architects and urbanists, we actually don't get the opportunity to build this kind of relational project. We get to build individual buildings in a context that is previously stated, but actually this concept of relationality is something that is probably quite important. This painting was also discussed in an important way by the Italian architect and theorist Aldo Rossi during the late 60s, early 70s, where, well, actually it was discussed for the reprint of his book, Architecture and the City, where he discusses it in these terms. The geographical transposition of the monuments within the painting constitutes a city that we recognize, even though it is a place of purely architectural references. This example enabled me to demonstrate how a logical, formal operation could be translated into a design method and then into a hypothesis for a theory of architectural designs in which the elements were pre-established and formally defined, but where the significance that sprung forth at the end of the operation was the authentic, unforeseen, and original meaning of the work. Now, I think whether we agree with this operation or not, this is not the point, but simply the fact of its migration from one place to another. Can I do the next? And you see that in this painting by William Marlowe, a similar thing happens where London becomes now the Venice, or Venice becomes London, with St. Paul's in the background and these paintings in the foreground. Now, I think the idea is not so much in this concept of just simply being able to also play this kind of duality, this ambiguity between conditions. But I think what is more important, the reason I show this work, is that how could the relational situation between things that are migrating, architectural objects, architectural projects that are migrating, can occur in relation to their situation where in fact you set up new spatial conditions. It just isn't something which still has the presence of its originary condition and its site, but it now sets up a situation which actually erases this condition of origin and sets up new possibilities. We see that also in terms of the transformation of ideas, that architects have really traveled quite a lot. There's a very long history of architects traveling, and a building around the corner here by John Soane is a fantastic example of how the influence of travel, of bringing things from abroad and placing them in a context where you see the building from outside, it just looks like an ordinary London terrace, but actually the reality of the spatial conditions that are set up inside this house become very specific in terms of the travels, the imagination of the architect. For me, the emphasis is constantly on this idea of imagining things. The other idea is to do with the concept of misrepresentation, in a sense, or a certain kind of misplacing of things. Everyone thinks that there is something uniquely kind of English about Bath, and such a kind of wonderful historic city it is. But I think it's also important for us to remember that when Bath was designed, it is based on a reference to certain notions of, for example, of Roman architecture or Roman planning, and actually the architects of this particular project, because they had not visited Italy and are operating from books and so on and so forth, get the scale of the whole thing completely wrong. So it's actually not about the authenticity of this reference, but it's about the idea of the misreading of the reference and how that misreading can itself be very positive. Another version of this idea is obviously presented by the concept of the thing that is strange then being in our midst, which can of course be very well represented by something like the Brighton Pavilion and all the kind of exotic associations of that. Many people now, when they see this building, they don't think about it being, in a sense, a building in India or whatever. It's also something which is very much part and parcel of Brighton. But nevertheless, I think it's still not quite what I am referring to in terms of the relationship to the origin being erased. So there is still that something of that as a kind of exotic reference that remains. And we have probably a more precise version of this concept of mixing. If we look at the work of people like Schindler in the States, where you have an architect who goes from Austria to America, is looking at Japanese influences, and the whole mixing of these things in terms of his relationship to someone like Wright becomes part of a new form of spatial construct in terms of his houses, in terms of the interiors, and so on. So all of these projects are projects that use their various references, various sources, as part of imagining something that in some way is better, it's more productive, it's more interesting than what has been there before. And I think given the kinds of issues that come up in the photographs upstairs, in the discussions today, we of course can talk. I think we obviously must be aware of this sort of difficulty, as has been mentioned a few times, between the kind of cosmopolitanism and the difficulties of racism and so on that exist. But you see that in terms of London, the transformations that have occurred over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of certain parts of public space have been quite significant. I think what's important is what can we actually learn from this situation. It is not only just to observe it in terms of it as a space of appearance, but actually how does it transform the spatial condition of the city? What new forms of relation does it set up that we didn't have before, and what might be learned from this in order to use it in terms of our projects? Because again, you have to remember that as architects we have to make projects, and we have to have a different way of beginning our projects or developing our projects than what we've had. And I want to show you just very quickly a couple of slides of a project that was done by one of my students before, looking at Koreatown in New York, which is between 28th Street and 34th Street, east of Broadway, where the Korean community have actually taken relatively kind of regular buildings, and through the way that they occupy it with a multiplicity of new programs, have actually transformed the spatial dimension of these buildings. So how the ground floor is different, how the elevator becomes a new way of really describing, for example, conditions of threshold, just simply through the way that keys work, the buttons work, and so on and so forth. So the variety of things here, but also a different concept of public space, which is now a vertical public space rather than just simply having the floors separated. And I think this project will take a long time to describe, but I think that this was based on the idea that if you look at the way in which the Korean community have actually occupied this space and you map it, you might understand something about buildings that in fact look the same. And this is what I, in a sense, want to respond to Michael Hibbert, where certain things in terms of the city look the same, but actually are spatially radically different from what they were before or what they look like. And whether there is another kind of architecture that can come out of this spatial transformation, or this idea of how the space itself is used in very pragmatic terms. So, for example, here they have managed to introduce a very different kind of public space at the back of the building, which normally would not be used in this way, and how a variety of different owners begin to occupy a space deep in the interior of the building. And just looking at the way in which the elevator shaft at different floors begins to have a variety of different entry conditions with where it's open, where it's closed, where there's a video entry, and so on. So somehow that relationship between now technology and the minor kind of transformations radically changes the whole question of the spatial characteristics of these buildings. And this is basically a kind of composite plan of all the different things that are happening in this building at a variety of different floors. And of course, it's not only to do with the idea of rendering things that are in this case, in terms of the buildings, they become invisible, these programs, because they are part of the interior. But I think in this project that was done by two students from the AA, it's also the invisible conditions that assume a dimension of visibility, where they recorded the time between 7 o'clock in the morning and 7:30 in the morning, when that is the time between the closure of one market, I think, in Tokyo, and the opening of another one in London, and how that space of the global market in some way also has a spatial repercussion in terms of, for example, the use of a certain part of London. The other thing that I think is worth touching on is that we talk about sort of facilities and amenities and so on, but I live very close to this building, the Swiss Cottage Library. And now it's very difficult for us to start even thinking about the possibility of constructing something of the scale of Swiss Cottage Library with the swimming pool, with the library, and so on. It's just actually very, very difficult. It now appears to be a very visionary project in a strange way. And I believe that in terms of a certain kind of minor transformations of existing projects, there is a great deal of room by looking at these buildings and seeing in what way could we actually construct projects that go, this becomes the starting point and actually builds on the idea of hybrid structures that include a multiplicity of new forms of programs. For example, if we're talking about this in relation specifically to questions of post-colonialism or certain kinds of people of underclass and so on, the whole concept of the library as a program could be dreamt of, thought of differently, because now with the way that technology is available, so on and so forth, you could imagine certain kinds of spaces, certain kinds of buildings, certain kinds of libraries, where they provide, again, a very different enabling framework in terms of the citizens. And this is something that we simply don't have. How can we have it? If we have the existing situation where the program for all of these projects is written by a client, and then the architect is simply the one who executes the project, we're never going to be in a position where we can actually use the architectural project as part of a process of speculating about issues. So what I would like to suggest, and what I think is happening at the school, is that maybe there needs to be more ways in which the concept of speculation, the concept of imagining, already is seen in terms of its political repercussion. I think this is something that Mark partly touched on, where you need to imagine a project that is by definition a political project. It is not something that comes because it has a social good. So I would very clearly make a distinction between this direct link between intentionality in some way and, for example, value judgments made about projects. Historically, if people have said they're doing something which is good, it's meant that maybe the project has also been good. I don't think that this relationship exists as a one-to-one thing. So one has to really disengage this relationship between intentionality and the evaluation of the project. And these are just simply other examples of infrastructural hybrid structures. This is for a bus terminal that some students did here at the AA for the roundabout in Elephant and Castle, and trying to see how these new forms of infrastructural conditions could lead to more interesting kind of, but also helpful situations. And this is really a slide to remind us of this situation where so much of the housing, the public housing that exists, doesn't really have all this kind of mixed and dynamic relationships that we have referred to in terms of the city, because the public spaces of many of these housing projects are really devoid of the layers of the kind of archaeology of the different programs that exist in the central part of the city. And one of our projects should be to rethink some of these projects that we've inherited from the 60s, from the 50s, from the 60s, 70s, and so on, to really try and build additional layers of public space in terms of transforming the projects of housing. Some of this work has been done at the school. These are, for example, some projects that looked at such housing estates and basically the relationship between landscape and the urban, or landscape and housing, trying to really transform the spaces between public buildings, and using, I think, in the school very much this connection between landscape urbanism and the urban, in the sense that's quite different than historical traditional planning, but there's no time to discuss that. And that might, in fact, obviously continue to new forms of surface conditions, places for events, which is part of this project of imagining, which I was referring to. Lastly, I think that, as I said, with the whole issue of the mayor, it is a fantastic opportunity right now for us, and I think there's a lot of work that's happening in the school to think about this issue differently than just being confronted or being presented with two buildings. I mean, I am not sure what is the logic of just jumping into two architects, two buildings, two speculative developers building this building when nobody has really decided what is it that we want out of the mayor, what is it that we want in terms of the kind of provisions for the city, in order to then understand what kind of architecture, what kind of spatial condition, what kind of building we need to do in order to respond to that. We are returning once again to the idea of the building as some kind of a representational token of some kind of urban civic realm, without really understanding that the concept of town hall is completely up for grabs, because it's very much should be related to the kind of city that that town hall is going to enable in terms of its liberative possibilities. So I feel that this is something that's happening in the school. It's very exciting, and we really need to be much more participating in these issues. And we have, I feel, been excluded in a sense from this discussion, because the first time you hear about these things is through the pages of BD or AJ, that somehow there is only down to 2 people designing the town hall, and it's just going to be, it's going to be decided. It has been decided, and I think there needs to be obviously a greater level of discussion on this particular issue. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. And we've only got about 8 minutes left, and I'd very much like the audience to participate. So if there are any questions addressed to any of us on the panel, we would like to take them. Yes? We've got a microphone.
Amongst the audience, I feel there's quite a few artists. I'm a practicing artist myself. And I'm just wondering to what extent combining art and architecture, possibly in the form of public art, how that could assist the intervention of urban intervention, basically.
Art and architecture.
I missed your question. Sorry, can you just repeat it? My mind just went blank for a second.
Okay, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is amongst the audience here, we're not all architects and we have different reasons for being here. I'm an artist and I'm primarily concerned in public art, and I'm just wondering to what extent art and artists and architects can be working together to help to enable a form of urban intervention.
Can I leap in? Yeah, obviously public art is tremendously important, and I mean there are many, many countries in Europe which have very strongly built-in policies of commissioning public art. In fact, we saw the planning gain. In a sense, I'm not sure whether it was art or whether it's monumentalism, but one way or another, there you've got a bit of sculpture in a park on the back of a residential development, and it's part of the deal. And that's, in one way or another, is the basic mechanism by which so much new, high-quality public art has been delivered to the streets of Barcelona and the streets of Paris. But it's the street aspect, the setting of the art, that, to me, is the important thing. Mayor Maragall of Barcelona had a great project which was called the monumentalization of the suburbs. So he took grotty, real cheapo mass housing projects that had been thrown up during the Franco years all around the edge of Barcelona, which was accommodation stacked at high density with very little disregard to what happened when you came out of the lift shaft at ground floor level. And he built streets and places, and having made these spaces, defined them with curbstones, given them quality by planting palm trees, which are imported at great expense from Africa, you then had to have a climax. And what better climax is there than to commission you to create the object that becomes the focus of the community? It's an obvious idea, but of course it needs organising. And we can see good examples of it.
Can I don't want to ask a question. I just want to re-ask the question that was asked before. Because I think in a way, like, the AA over the last few years has forged very, very close relations with the art world, to the point in a sense where the consideration of objects, space, whatever, isn't a question of what existed before as public art, The question really is about how architects and artists combine about the production of space. So maybe like the rest of the... I mean, I hope it's not presumptuous to sort of say that in effect, that maybe...
Well, I think, my own idea is that art is generally an afterthought in the initiation of any project. And also it's the architect's response to the artist. I mean, where in the art hierarchy, most of what is around, a lot of what is around in terms of public art isn't considered at the moment. So a lot of it is a joke in its own self. But and on a more realistic terms, there are people who are, probably not myself, who are more concerned with social issues and in narratives, and trying to work more cohesively with architects and to probably take it more seriously, so that something is born from the initiation but not as an afterthought. So if art is integral to a concept.
There are a lot of things that are happening in the schools, and I think what is important about it is that it is not in this traditional form of collaboration, that people are actually working together. We have many, for example, we have a number of units where one of the units has been, for the last few years, Richard Wentworth teaching in the unit, and people are, it's not this thing of there is the architect and there is the artist, people are just working together. So one is to do with just the educational procedures and so on like that. Another is really the way in which we have had, for example, 2 weeks ago, an installation here from Richard Wilson, working with some of the students and working with the company called Lokho, which is a film production company, really established. And the way that they were engaged in their project, it's an incredibly spatial project that they are addressing this concept of transparency that they were dealing with. What I think is important is that it actually has broken those kinds of barriers where you have like such a percentage for art as a kind of tradition, as an adjective, but it has become much more of a collaboration. And in a few weeks' time, we will have a house that will be on in the exhibition, which is the work of 7 people together, one of whom, or two of them, happen to be architects, but in fact the graphic designer, sound person, and so on and so forth. And the house is the project of these people. It was not that the architects did the building, and then the other people came along and put something on the wall. I think this is, to my mind, it's a necessary way of thinking about this, so that people are actually working together, as you said, from the beginning and not just the project. Example, because I think in terms of the whole idea of how you even discuss architecture, it changes. It de-emphasizes in some way this overemphasis that has been there, so I think that's the representational dimension of what the thing is supposed to mean initially. I think that process of delaying itself, I think very useful for the work.
Thank you. I know Michael wants to respond to this.
When you asked your question, one of the slight problems I had when I was thinking through a response to it was that there's always a slight problem in it of almost reifying the artist on the one hand and the architect on the other. And my worry would be about what kinds of representational practices we're talking about in which particular kinds of arena. And there's a sense in which I think, first of all, of when you actually look at the places like Canary Wharf with big public art budgets and certain kinds of presentational forms of London's cosmopolitanism. So if you go to Canary Wharf last week, they were celebrating Chinese London, and again, without getting hung up in authenticity games and so on, there was something about that I don't think quite worked, to put it mildly. And yet, on the other hand, there are individuals like the artist, again, in the place I know best, people like the artist Abu Jaffa, who is actually trying to turn Brick Lane currently into kind of in the spirit of Christo, trying to turn Brick Lane into a momentary river covered in glass and kind of symbols of alternatives. And I think in the Rich Mix Centre, Panchayat, who I think were here earlier on, thinking through very specifically particular kinds of representational practice, and without going kind of down the artist as ethnographer type of line, I think it's possible to look at the things that people like Rosalind Deutsch have talked about in New York and so on, as ways in which particular kinds of intervention are possible. But just having said all that, I want to say, again, without being too nostalgic about it, I think if you look also, there is an importance in some of the old municipalism. So if you go down Cable Street, there is a sub-Rivera type mural which memorializes the Battle of Cable Street. And it has an importance. I mean, it has an importance, I think, which is signified by the fact that, as recently as a few months ago, Combat 18 were trying to deface it, and there is again an iterative articulation of the politics of Cable Street through that mural. And so I think we need to think through again the relationship between where the big public art commissions are coming from, particularly in big regeneration schemes, and the kinds of values that are implicit in them. And so, but also with a breaking down of exactly what are the aesthetic practices that everybody, not just reified artists, are up to. But
Thank you. Yeah, that's clear. I want to pick up the idea that somehow architecture lags behind. I think this has been said 2 or 3 times today. But if you turn this round and think, instead of post-colonial London, if you think about post-colonial Delhi, which I've done some study of, architecture not only does not lag behind, but actually leads. Architecture is the first expression of the changes that are present in the society. And it's always fascinated me how it is, and it's interesting that it actually happened after the British left in Delhi, which is when the country changed visibly, while the British were there. In fact, actually it was after 1960, so you could allow 15 years of sort of hangover for getting things together, 5-year plans and so on. But whilst the fabric of the city changed dramatically, so much so that there's complete abandoning of all traditional ways of building and a complete embrace. I think it's quite true in Mohsen's terms that what's going on behind the facades may well be not what you might expect. However, the fact is that visibly the city is totally transformed, dramatically transformed. And I was always wondering how it is that when there's that kind of cultural collision, the art forms that survive. So cooking almost survives. Actually, many of my relatives tell me, however, that cooking isn't like it used to be. However, they do, by and large, survive. And music survives. Women's clothes survive, almost as they were. Men's clothes don't. Men now wear business suits in the heat of Delhi in June. And, however, so here, we've been hearing it's the other way around. And I think maybe this is because actually architecture is much more an expression of power than any of these other forms are, in a funny way which I don't really understand. But it seems to me that there isn't really a alternative architecture, because these forms are actually traditional forms. They're not themselves forms in tremendous development in their own right. These are all, when we talk about minority ethnic or ethnic forms, all of ethnicity is really about traditions, about things that used to happen. And I think that is probably the explanation of why we think architecture lags behind, and why I think it's maybe a red herring, this question. I think that it's maybe irrelevant, because architecture for us, it's an art which doesn't really know its boundaries. So we actually fairly haplessly engage as architects and urbanists into huge areas of other subjects, and then kind of try to, at the same time, compare them.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. Just to come back to this very quickly, every year in the United States around February, which is the Martin Luther King's birthday, Black History Month is proclaimed, and every year they try to investigate some new discipline, or literature one year, music the next year, and this year it happened to be architecture. And the incredible confusion and the ramifications of sort of selecting architecture as this thing to respond to Black History Month has been quite phenomenal. And in some ways, I mean, your point is a really good one, that elsewhere architecture is kind of at the forefront and not behind. But for many of us who are here, trying to kind of grapple with these issues here and not there, it becomes a really important, a really problematic issue. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to take one more question. Sorry, yeah. Can you get the microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Mohsen a question. You made 3 points which were absolutely clear. I wanted you to expand on the issue of the hybridization on the large structures. I just wanted to also say, before you do that, whether you think there's a danger in trying to expect architecture to be too active in the process, because sometimes I feel architecture being behind maybe is not such a bad thing, because architecture at times could be an enabler. But would you be able to expand on that second point?
When I discussed that building in New York, in Koreatown, for me I think that there's something really quite important in terms of those structures being hybrid, and that what happens in those buildings, the way that uses have been transformed, is quite different from the kind of normative ways that architects discuss their projects or plan their projects. There's actually a great deal of unexpected situations that occur. Why is that possible? For me, one of the things that is possible that maybe it's to do with this idea of architecture not being behind, is that there is certain part of the structure of the city that has the possibility of transformation, while there might be other parts of the city where it's harder for this transformation to occur. I'm somehow suggesting that, for example, the city single function buildings are harder in some ways to transform than the Victorian, let's say 19th century house, where the concept of demolition, demolishing the wall, changing the internal relationship, and so on, is easier to deal with than when you're dealing with a kind of large scale multi-project. So somehow this concept of the hybrid is a useful mechanism in order to allow us to deal with those think through alternative projects that allow that to occur. And it also, of course, suggests that we have to find ways in which we should transform our I think on the other side, there is a suggestion that maybe there could also be a rethinking in terms of the relationship between architecture and the area, which is happening very much in schools, not just at where the buildings have become sufficiently large, where the concept of, for example, interior urbanism or interior landscapes are becoming part of the conversation, where you don't just get the shopping mall as the interior, but you get an interior of a building that is also
I'm getting furious hand signals, so we're going to have to stop. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the panel.